Hello, welcome everyone. Good afternoon, welcome. Good afternoon, happy Thursday, welcome everyone. Just going to give it a couple more minutes so we can give everybody an opportunity to enter into the webinar.
Hey team, it seems like the chat is disabled. Someone noticed that and I just tried to type in and it is disabled. Can we Okay, looks like it's working now. At least for panelists.
It looks like it's still disabled. Someone just said it's still disabled. I think they're working on it. Let's see. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Probably good morning to some people, depending on where you are. My name is Bianca Myrick. I'm a consultant with the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series with the National Mentoring Resource Center. And we are going to go ahead and get started with our wonderful webinar today, Mentoring in the New Normal, Maximizing Participant Engagement in these still COVID-y times. All right, so before we officially get started, I just want to go over just a couple of housekeeping things. All attendees should be muted just for best sound. If you have any questions, type it in the Q&A panel, comments in the chat box. We are working on getting that chat box up. Live captions are available in the panel by clicking on the CC that's at the bottom of the screen. If there are any polls, I'm not sure if we have any today. I don't think we do. Respond to them. And as soon as we get that chat up, we would love for you just to go ahead and introduce yourselves, maybe just say what organization you're here on behalf of or where you're from. Looks like they're still working on the chat, so we'll go ahead and move on. All right, so can you just go back? All right, so just so you know, 1 week after the webinar, everyone will receive an email with instructions on how to access the PDF of the presentation slides. And you'll also receive instructions on how to access the webinar recording. You'll also get a link to our webpage where all the slides, recordings, and other resources are posted. And then, of course, you're going to receive a survey, and we would love for you to fill out the survey when everything is done so that we can get feedback and so that we can incorporate your feedback as we move forward with the series. All right, it looks like the chat is working now. All right, we've got lots of different people here. Miami-Dade College, Brooklyn, Chicago, South Carolina, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Be a Mentor, Women on the Move, more Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Minnesota, Ohio, wonderful. All right. All right, so I am pleased to introduce our facilitator for today, Dustian North, who is the Research Director for the California Mentoring Partnership. Dustian is a researcher of mentoring and equity and justice in service systems. She's been a trainer and technical assistance provider for youth mentoring and related youth services since 1995. Dustian has focused on youth families and transition-aged youth that are in high distress. So this could be like child welfare, housing crisis, runaways, or the justice system. Her work is rooted in emancipatory abolitionist practices and participatory research approaches. She loves to bridge research and practice toward quality evidence-based services. And Dustian is a lecturer and researcher at UC Berkeley School of Social Welfare. Thank you for facilitating, Dustian.
Thank you, Bianca. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to address this topic. Mentoring is it's not the only field I work in, but it's my oldest and longest love in the services field. And coming up on 30 years, a couple of years. And I'm just really excited about today's topic, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, because after so many years in this field, our field is really changing. COVID has really been one of those disruptive, in the sense of innovation, it's been one of those it's been disrupted all of our lives, hasn't it? But it's also been a disruption that brings innovation and change. So it's exciting on that level. And then also, of course, we know that the pandemic has both increased stressors and disparities for marginalized communities. So it's really laid bare a lot of the work that we have to do. And so it's very close to my work and very close to my heart, and I'm very happy to be here. So just to give a little bit of an overview on what we're doing here today. So not telling you all anything you don't know, COVID came along and forced us to virtualize and or distance in a big hurry. And at the same time, the needs of our families and our mentors and our youth were changing really fast. So we adapted, right? And that means that there's been significant changes in what typical mentoring programs and practices look like today, and that some of these may last into the future. So some key questions that we're hoping to answer today are what have we learned about how to best engage youth, families, and mentors in the face of the COVID crisis, and what might this say about best engagement strategies anytime or in times of other kinds of crisis, or maybe with families that are particularly hard to engage. And then what are the implications of these changes for program operations in the coming months? So that's what we're here to look at today. And so our learning objectives, always got to have learning objectives, right? We're hoping that you'll get a lot of both practice and research insights about engagement strategies that programs have found effective during the pandemic. We think some new lessons will come out today about the effective engagement of caregivers in particular, which was a need for improvement already identified in our field before the pandemic started. There's some good research and a lot of practice conversations about the idea that in a lot of spaces we could be doing a much better job engaging parents and caregivers. And so then the pandemic has changed that yet again. And also understandings of potentially changing roles for program staff, new capacity concerns, some of those kinds of things. So that's what we hope you'll get out of today. And just as a way of conceptualizing the pandemic, right, because we're in real time here, things are unfolding and changing all the time. So we've kind of conceptualized the pandemic in 3 phases so far. And the first phase, I call it like the great pivot. It was the initial crisis when everyone had to literally stop what they were doing and completely, find a way to shift gears and respond to kind of the shocking crisis at the beginning. And then there was a period of what I would call sort of adapted services where we had limitations, but we also had innovations, and the orientation were changing, and we came up with a way to serve during lockdowns, during distancing, during constant change, and kids doing remote schooling, and parents sometimes working from home or sometimes not, et cetera. So you could think of that as like, the rest of 2020 and probably all of 2021 are close to it. And then in the last, not quite a year perhaps, we've started to settle into what we might think of as the new normal. I'm sure we can all agree it's not exactly normal, and we don't know exactly where it's headed, but things have opened. We're trying to live life with COVID, and so it's a bit of a different phase than the earlier parts. So that's kind of how we're thinking of the pandemic. And all this means that we're in very uncharted territory, right? So all of the knowledge that we're collecting and gaining right now is very emergent. It's some things will continue to change. We don't really know what's coming. It's hard to capture lessons and really know what they meant. So what that means is that we have some things to share today from what we've learned, but we also really want to know what you've been learning and what you've been seeing. So I'm so glad we got the chat up and going again. I hope you'll use it liberally. Anytime we're presenting ideas or findings from research, we'd love to hear in the chat how that's played out for you or other things that you've observed that we didn't cover. And there will be time towards the end of our session for you to ask questions and to weigh in more actively when we get towards the end. So we're going to do a lot of our kind of presenting information at the beginning. Then we're going to do kind of a panel discussion, and then we'll be opening it up to your questions, et cetera. And I think Bianca already said this, but feel free to put your questions in the chat anytime, and we're collecting them. And towards the end, we're going to take as many as we can. So we hope you'll participate as actively as you can. So with that, I would really love to introduce our panelists today. We're very excited to have 2 really, really esteemed and prominent and wonderful folks. So first off, I'm excited to introduce Jamila Tramiel, and she's from Chicago South Side with a background in health and educational leadership. She's the founder of the Ladies of Virtue in Chicago, which is an award-winning mentoring and leadership program serving over 2,000 families. She's on the steering committee for the Greater Bronzeville Neighborhood Network and the Status of Women and Girls Working Group. She's a TEDx speaker and a co-author of a status report on teen girls in Chicago from the Coalition on Urban Girls. She's a mayoral appointee for the 78 Community Advisory Council in Chicago, and she got her education in health systems management and education from some great and prominent universities. and we're very excited to have her here. She's also a graduate of the Impact Leadership Development Program, and she lives in the South Loop community with her husband, Damien. So welcome, Jamila. Feel free to wave at us if you have a moment to turn on your camera. Hi,
Hello,
Jamila.
thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here, and we'll hear more from Jamila in just a few minutes. And I also want to introduce our other panelist, Roger Jarjora, who many of you have heard of or read his research. He is a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research, AIR, with a PhD in criminology from the University of Maryland and over 25 years experience developing and evaluating mentoring programs. He kind of started out as a PI on a randomized control study of the impact of mentoring as a component of juvenile justice reentry, and the results showed that mentoring was a critical part of that. So then they did an expansion for the whole state of Indiana, and Roger ran that program. So he's a practitioner as well for a number of years. And since then, he's provided extensive training and technical assistance in effective reentry programs, in mentoring systems involve youth and children of incarcerated parents. And he's done some real prominent research in our field. Most notably, he did an evaluation of OJJDP's mentoring enhancement demonstration program. He did a cross-site mentoring implementation and measurement. He was the lead on a multi-state implementation of mentoring with juvenile drug court programs. And he was the co-PI on a multi-site randomized controlled trial evaluation of mentoring programs nationwide to assess the impact of cognitive behavioral enhancements in mentoring. And most recently, and most relevant to today, Roger is the PI on some new California-based research that we've been doing through our California Mentoring Partnership, studying the impact of COVID on mentoring programs. And I feel very honored to have worked with Roger on that study. So he's our PI, and I'm one of the researchers as well. So he's going to present most of our findings about that, and I'll pipe up here and there as well. So welcome, Roger. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, great to have you. So let's begin, and we're going to begin with Roger with some understandings of this exciting new research we've been doing in California, which captures data from program staff during the earlier phases of the pandemic, so what I earlier described as phases 1 and 2. So I think our study spanned from late 2020 until late 2021 is when people were completing the survey. And it was preceded by some roundtable discussions we were having in California about what folks were dealing with during the pandemic. And so the survey was informed by that. So the goals of our research were to understand what challenges did the COVID-19 pandemic pose to youth and families, and to programs themselves. What adaptations did programs make in response to all of that? And what effective strategies have emerged for mentoring in the pandemic. That's what we're kind of looking at. And our methods to do that, so the domains we kind of looked at were youth needs and how to reach them, family needs and how to reach them, mentor needs and how to reach them, and also program structure changes. And we had both quantitative and qualitative data. It was a long survey, I'll say that. Folks were really wonderful to spend. We had 48 programs, I think, that ended up with full valid responses. It probably took them 30 to 45 minutes to fill out this very comprehensive thing, and we had a lot of closed-ended checklists and things like that they could, say yes to this, no to that, or rate things. And then we also had some open-ended responses, so we'll be able to share both of those kinds of data. So with that all said, I would love to turn to Roger to hear a little more about what we learned. And Roger, if you could first just help us understand a little bit more before we get into some of the details of strategies that worked and things like that. What were some of the broad changes that jumped out at us right from the start about big changes in the mentoring field? Like, how will programs look fundamentally different, perhaps moving forward, than they did prior to the pandemic?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. If you want to go on to the next. So what we have here, so this is the word cloud is showing you. So based on people's responses, right? So where we got the highest frequencies, that's reflected in sort of the bigger font here. But the sort of the big sort of standout finding here is that programs going forward are going to be hybrid. There were lots of good reasons, right, why programs before the pandemic tried to really resist virtual contact. But when we were forced to figure out if that was a way to do that, we learned that there were safe ways that we could do this, that could work, that it wasn't going to undermine in many ways, right, the development of these meaningful mentoring relationships. And so that's one thing that people are going to take with them, or taking with them, right, as a legacy of the last 2.5 years. But we also one of the things that's probably going to stick around at least for a while, and this may be regional too, is for in-person aspects. COVID safety is still going to be a lasting concern in all programming, right? And we're talking about young people who, when they interact with their mentor, they're going to go back to their family where there could be people, that are vulnerable, right? So that those are going to continue to be relevant issues. And in California, where we did the research, we're still very, very careful about COVID practices. I work in an office where we still have to wear masks in the building all the time. And so several respondents also noted that they had enhanced their match support significantly, and that they're going to keep those enhancements in place even after the pandemic ends. And then other changes mentioned here, some of the smaller words. So, offering more comprehensive services than before, higher program utilization. For some people, it was easier to be engaged if they didn't have to travel. And again, depending on where you were, traveling in California could sometimes be a process. And increased planning, retaining, partnerships, right? Looking, being more creative about the kinds of partnerships that were there and where some of the needs were. And if they developed new content, right? If they put training programs online or curricula online, there's no reason why we can't retain those and continue to use those. Let's go on to the next. So a couple of things that we learned across the programs that participated is that there were really sort of three broad groups where key needs that arose that were specific to the young people in the programs. So those were social emotional needs, educational needs, and then mental health. And remember, during the pandemic, right, where kids are not going to school in the school buildings, right, they're at home, and immediately we start to realize just how the capacity for some that wasn't equal across all young people in terms of, did they have the capacity to be online? Did they have the support in their house in order to do that well? And so those were things that mentoring programs could pivot, right, to try to address. And then certainly mental health issues too. And the longer the pandemic went on, the more that was an issue that programs were dealing with. Let's go on to the next.
And I can jump in here and ask you a question, Roger.
Yep.
So as I was saying at the start of the session, in addition to having to distance and all of that, programs really pivoted to meet these changing needs like the ones you mentioned in the last slide. But this was also about family needs, not just about the needs of youth changing, because families were really struggling as the pandemic hit. And so in some ways, mentoring programs were providing much more comprehensive services or different services than they ever had in the past. And the adaptations they made to meet these might leave kind of a lasting stamp on their programs. So can you tell us a little bit more about what were some of the emergent needs that staff were finding themselves addressing during the pandemic that might have been different than before?
Yeah, absolutely. So on this slide, what we're showing is, so when we ask so again, remember that the program staff are responding here. So this is what the program staff are telling us. So they were telling us, so what percentage, so that top one, 74% is saying that most of the families in their program, this is true of, right? So this is about, so if they said, oh, this only affected a little, they're not included in that 74%. So 74% of the programs that responded to the survey said that this was that families really had an issue with access to technology, which included both computer and phone, right? And so that was something that the need arose, and immediately, right, the programs were thinking about how could they help address that. Almost 70% said it was mental and physical health care as well. Also, about 2/3 said advocacy on behalf of their participants. 60% found that families needed access to food and help with that. We've got just over half said eviction protection and rental assistance was a need that families really struggled with. Personal protective equipment was an issue for just about half of the families, being able to get that. And we did this survey just to help you think about the context, right? So we started in early 2021, right? So most of this happened in 2021, but earlier in the pandemic, right, was where people really struggled, right? So as soon as we decided that, yes, it is a good idea to use the personal protective equipment, then so the programs really stepped up to help families get access to those equipment. Hygiene items, about 1/3, and same thing, about 1/3, a combination of domestic violence issues and child maltreatment issues that sort of emerged when families were forced to stay in their house altogether. Okay, and so then we looked at, and were you gonna? No.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah. This is. So then the question is, how did it change the roles of staff to kind of help address these needs, and what did staff finding themselves needing to grapple with in order to meet some of those needs?
Yeah, and the biggest thing across the programs was the need for increased communication and monitoring too, right? So this wasn't just about helping people be connected virtually, but also, the responsibility of the program to monitor, because again, we had come from the programs had come from this sort of tradition, right, of being very, very reluctant to allow there to be this virtual contact. This included increased check-ins with all participants, staff monitoring virtual match meetings when that was happening, updating their tracking systems and project coordination software, and increased and improved staffing as well too, right? So this likely meant that they needed to have more staff, more time devoted by staff to these tasks as well. Staff training and support also was noted here. So how do we help staff be prepared? Training for new and increased staff. Many programs dealt with turnover among people who had their own family needs and needed to move out or couldn't carry out their job when they themselves were confined to their homes as well. Team support meetings among staff, and then just an appreciation of being able to promote self-care, which included, we heard from some programs that included offering incentives around that as well. Other responses included adjusting goals to circumstances, determining the cause of negative actions, increasing problem solving, doing more around remote work and using technology, and also being flexible in terms of changing venue. All right, let's go on to the next.
Wonderful. And so here's the question then, in this brave new world of virtual programming or hybridized programming, is it safe to assume that we can serve all families virtually?
Yeah, great. So this first, and I'm going to show you 3 pieces here that really get at this whole question about the digital divide. So when we ask programs, which of the youth that you were serving did the best in participating on virtual platforms? So the biggest factor that program, again, the program staff are the one reporting this back to us, is that it really mattered when the young people had the support and the encouragement from their families. And so you see that a third, right, that wasn't, programs didn't find that was going to be the case. Also, it was important if youth were comfortable with technology, right? And we heard programs say that one of the ways that they tried to sort of provide additional support was to help the young people become more comfortable with technology, have the access that they needed. Youth with access to technology was also important too. If you live in a family where there's only one phone, it may not always be possible for the young person to be able to meet with a mentor. If they can't have connect, if the parent is working and or the other kids are in school, and so that was a real issue. One of the interesting things, so we asked them, is it younger participants that do better? Is it older participants? 46% of the program said it really was the younger participants that did better, but 41% said no, it was the older participants. So not sure what to make of that, but that was an interesting sort of split here. Let's go on to the next one. So here we asked about what was their experience in terms of how equipped the mentors, the mentees were to meet with the mentors virtually. And as it turns out, 61%, right? So a good amount felt like that was doable, right? That the young people had access to the technology that they needed in order to be able to connect with mentors effectively. And I see the question in the chat. Can you define what younger? So that literally was how we had it on the survey: younger or older youth. And so, yeah, unfortunately, we can't unpack that more. Yeah. So the other thing, sort of on the other side of this, though, is that a number of the programs said, so we're still back on the other slide, is that it was often an issue that young people didn't have the privacy in their home to have conversation with mentors when they had to do it virtually. And so that was only the case in less than a third, that programs could confidently say that this was not an issue here. So it's something to keep in mind. And then that's certainly a barrier that we heard about the matches. Now we can go to the next one. And then the third piece here. So we're looking at, what about the families? How prepared were the families? How much were they equipped? And so turns out it was just about half of the programs felt like families were supportive of the virtual contact between youth and mentors. So think about all the reasons that programs might have been resistant or reluctant, and it turns out that families also too, for many of the programs, that continued to be an issue. But again, about 62% said that the families did have the capacity for the virtual contact. So that's pretty similar to what we saw in the last slide when we were looking at the capacity of the young people. Probably not surprising, right? That they're probably one and the same. But we did find that it was fewer of the programs, right? Just about a third said that the caregivers themselves have been able to engage in either virtual, or when we say distance contact, that meant that there was personal contact following all the, the rules, stay 6 feet apart with the mask. And that was something that we heard, and I'll touch on it a little bit later too, that wasn't always the best way to connect with families.
Great. Well, Roger, it's so helpful just to get some of those kind of big picture understandings and trends before we get into some more of the details of how programs really made this work. But that's where we want to go now, is what have we learned, or what are we learning, I should say, in this emergent moment about how to best engage youth, mentors, and caregivers and families in this kind of new normal sort of environment. What can we learn from what people were telling us last year about how to kind of meet the moment? So let's go ahead and go through some of that information.
All right. So couple of things that we're talking about on this slide here. So first, what are the program aspects that worked well if we think about, how did things go in a virtual platform, virtual format? And I'll talk about some of the benefits too. So in terms of the aspects that worked well virtually, so coordination, oftentimes was something that was easy to do, maybe I'll say it was doable, right? And there were some benefits to being able to do things using more virtual options here. The programs found that if they had curriculum, or if they developed curriculum, that was nice to be able to house it online, and it was easy to use it there, and that was not a huge barrier. Also, that when we think about the academic, college, career readiness kinds of things, online worked really well for that, whether it was career, curriculum, coaching, other, it seemed like that was especially conducive to online contact. In terms of the benefits of virtual programming, so one thing when we think about access, right? So in areas where transportation and being for mentors to be able to get together with the young people, suddenly that was not an issue. It made logistics easier for staff in some cases. Some youth, turns out, preferred to do things online. And we found that particularly in terms of the online partnership, or the partnerships between mentoring programs and school districts, that doing online was something that facilitated that partnership. All right. So here, so when we asked about in-person programming, so what are the things that program staff really felt like it still works best if we do things in person? So one of the things that, the two big ones here that jump out, right? So for group activities, it still seems to work best for programs, according to programs, right, if they do those in person. And also when it involves more sensitive topics, sensitive social relational work, community relationship building, when they're trying to address some sensitive mental health issues. Restorative justice circles was one that folks said really worked best if it was in person. Other folks said some interactive group activities, matching, folks said still. And we don't, again, this was one that we really didn't ask questions in a way that we could unpack this. So that's just really interesting. And we'd be open to, your thoughts about this too. We're imagining this involves, how are you making the introduction between the mentor and the mentee? How are you even assessing if something's going to be a fit? If you're not meeting with the mentor in person or the young person in person, but it could also be, ongoing support of the match as well too. So again, we didn't ask questions in a way that we could impact this more, but this was something that came up that folks said really worked better. And again, some programs said this really worked better in person, and then some place-based activities as well too, sports, college visits, technical or artistic activities, folks said. And we've heard some creative things about dropping off kits and people working together, but if you had your preference, in-person programming would work best for that. Okay, let's go on. So we asked more about, if social, emotional, and educational needs were some of the bigger areas where that programs needed to kind of pivot in order to address. And so we asked them, and we were trying here to understand, so coming into the new normal, coming out of the pandemic, what are some things that you're going to keep this? So either these are areas that programs said, we were already doing this anyway, this is who we are, we're going to keep doing this, or these were things that programs tried and they made it clear, we're going to continue to do this. And so self-awareness exercises, 71% said that to be the case. Strength resilience activities, again, over 2/3, almost 2/3 said mindfulness development, educational support, 60%. Relationship mapping was something that over half said that they were going to keep doing that, and mood regulation activities, also more than half said that this was something that they were going to continue to do as part of their program. Then we asked about what were the strategies that you use to engage youth during this time, and which are of those strategies that you use, which ones were particularly effective in engaging youth? I'm going to show you the same kind of presentation about engaging families. And one of the interesting contrasts here is that almost everything that they tried with youth, they thought was effective. That wasn't the case with families, right? For families, there were a lot more, some things were really effective, some things were definitely not effective. But for the young people, almost all the ones that a substantial number of programs tried, they thought they were effective, right? So using a mode of contact, so where they were individualizing the type of contact so that it fit with based on what they knew about that individual, almost 100%, that was virtually everyone thought that was a good idea. Asking about needing what resources they needed was an effective strategy. 80% thought, said listening thoughtfully and being available. Utilizing games and interactivity for online engagement, also almost 80% said that was something that was particularly effective. Providing access to technology for virtual contact, coordinating with partners, which for many programs that was about school staff. Multilingual materials, almost 3/4 said that was a particularly effective strategy for engaging the youth. And then providing support and encouragement for phone and online engagement, 2/3 thought that was effective. In terms of thinking about what are the ways, or what did they learn about mentor engagement? So programs said that, if we're going to be asking them to work together virtually, we need to also recruit and screen around those virtual skills to make sure that that's something they're going to be comfortable doing. And if mentoring is going to be virtual, then offer the training virtually too. And that, so you can get a feel for, how comfortable they're going to be. Programs said, though, that low tech in-person skills were still going to be important. They were really looking for mentors who were going to be really serious about the COVID safety protocols. And again, so many of the young people served by these programs were in multi-generational families, homes where, they were greater risks than maybe the mentors were experiencing in their homes. Diversity and equity concerns take on a greater importance here, right? And so in just how programs realized that there were access issues for the young people they were trying to serve, this also could be a way that certain people were not coming to the table to be mentors too, because they didn't have the capacity as well. Flexibility and higher level of attunement and care were needed from mentors during the early phases. And mentors most often required more support from program staff than before the pandemic, which we're going to be getting to later in this webinar, is that the staff were taking on more responsibility, more of the burden here. Go ahead. So when we ask staff, to talk about, some tips and stuff, and so these are just some quick quotes. I won't cover all these, but program said, you got to be flexible, offer a framework or prompts, and be prepared to follow the conversation when it goes where it goes. Breakout sessions and smaller group sizes allow for the best sharing and bonding. Oh, I'm sorry. So these are. So one of the things that in my research outside of this project, right, that always comes up when we talk to mentors about what was most helpful, mentors always say one of the best things for them was when they had an opportunity to be together with other mentors. And we had asked programs to talk about whether they took the opportunity to have convenings for mentors virtually. And so what were some tips about how to make those work well? And so these are tips from program staff about how to do these mentor convenings. So breakout sessions, smaller group sizes, were better for sharing and bonding opportunities. And the cohort, having people stay in cohorts again, where they're coming together with the same people over and over again, that increased attendance and camaraderie. Having staff available, but letting it be led by an experienced mentor was one of the ideas that somebody mentioned here. Yeah, so let's go. I don't want to use up too much of our time here. So the last thing that I'll talk about here in this section. So we then ask programs, okay, so thinking about overall, right? So the experience that you've had with mentoring during the pandemic, has the overall strength and quality of the mentor-mentee relationships, has that increased, decreased, stayed the same? And interestingly enough, it's almost not quite a third split. Only 22% said it stayed the same. About almost 40% said it actually increased the quality, but almost 40% said it decreased the quality too.
Wonderful, thank you, Roger. Such helpful findings, if we do say so ourselves. And we're gonna hear from Jamila in just a moment here. Just want to answer a question from the chat. So the study, the question was how many participants were involved, students, families, and program staff. So this was a survey only of program staff, and we asked them questions about youth and about families and about program structure and mentors in the survey. And we had about 48 programs participate. So that's the answer to that question. So now that we've gotten a sense of what like 48 programs across California sort of together had to say, we'd love to take kind of a deeper dive into what this looked like from one exemplary program. And the Ladies of Virtue in Chicago really moved mountains to kind of meet families and youth and the girls that they serve during such a difficult time. They did some really exciting things, and Jamila learned a lot of really wonderful lessons about how to meet such a moment. So she's going to take us through her program's experiences. Welcome, Jamila. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and to talk about some of the things that we implemented during the pandemic and even now as we are, in these COVID-y times. But to give you a little bit more information about Ladies of Virtue, I just want to share with you that I started Ladies of Virtue 11 years ago, back in 2011. And it's really all about empowering our girls to become confident and purpose-driven leaders. There's some research that shows that Black girls are viewed as needing less nurturing, less supports, and less comfort than their peers. But we know that this perception is not reality. And so Ladies of Virtue is standing in the gap, providing our girls with mentors and preparing them for leadership in 3 ways: character development, career readiness, and civic engagement. And then after our girls graduate from high school, they then are supported and provided with mentoring up to 6 years after, even if they're in college or armed forces or trade school as well. So wanted to provide a little bit more about Ladies of Virtue. And then if you go to the next slide, this just provides a little bit more detail about how we are preparing our girls for leadership. As I mentioned, character development, career readiness, and civic engagement. I'll highlight the civic engagement component. That's one area what makes us stand out, if you will, where we are providing our girls with hands-on leadership projects. And so our participants are identifying topics that they're passionate about. They are then paired into groups of 3 to 5 girls. And then they also are partnered with a community organization that is working on that specific topic. And so then girls are going to that community organization, learning more about that specific topic. They then take what they learn to go back into their schools or communities and educate their peers about what they have learned. And so the final step is to present their impact to community leaders and executives. I really enjoyed hearing from Roger, because of course that process looked different in the pandemic, but we tried to stay true to the essence of our leadership projects, even during these COVID times. And so just wanted to share a little bit more about Ladies of Virtue. And I think I did not mention that we serve girls ages 9 to 18. initially, and then we continue to mentor and support them up to the age of 24. And then the last thing I'll say is that we do target Black girls here on the South and West Side in Chicago. You can go to the next slide. So we're talking about the pandemic, and I still remember the day, right, in March 2020, when our governor put out the stay-at-home order, and we were all traumatized and devastated. We had college tours planned, we had large graduation events planned, and all of a sudden everything came to a halt. But one thing I can say, in terms of the resiliency of Black girls, and you'll see some of the things that they've gone through. This study was created by A Long Walk Home. It's also another nonprofit organization right here in Chicago that targets Black girls. And they put out a study, it was really the first of its kind in the United States, to examine how two pandemics, you have the COVID-19 as well as the systemic racism that was going on, the pandemic and the protests, if you will, how that really impacted the lives and livelihood of Black girls and their families. And so as you'll see here, in the study that they conducted, 69% of Black girls said that they had increased anxiety. 62% said that they had even more nightmares and loss of sleep. 59% expressed that they had an increase in depression. And so as you see that the study that took place, honestly, we saw those very same concerns within the girls that we served. And so one of the things that we did almost immediately is just to have them to start talking about some of their mental health concerns on social media. So I know Roger mentioned that even though sometimes young people don't want to sit on a Zoom, they love getting on Instagram or posting a reel. So we try to leverage some of the current interests that they have, while also helping their peers as well. And so on the next slide, I don't think we have the video capability right now, but in the recording, feel free to click on that link, because this is one of our love sisters, Vontasia, and she put together a reel that we asked her to put together to really help her peers to deal with mental health during that time. So these are some of the creative things that we did just to help our girls. We saw that there was a need, and we wanted to immediately help impact the lives of our girls. And one way to do that is through social media. The next thing that we did was distribute a survey to our families. Because we're so focused on the girls, right? But we have to understand, especially when we were having our Zoom work sessions and all of that, we noticed that there was a lot of videos that were turned off, so we really didn't know, like, okay, what was going on. So one thing that we did immediately, this was a month after the stay-at-home order, we sent out a survey to their parents, and we said, how is this pandemic impacting you? Because we truly wanted to know what was going on in the homes of our girls. And one thing that we found out, two important things that we found out, was that 42% of our love families reported that they lost their jobs or had their work hours reduced. And I remember about that time, it was about 25% nationally. And so you see that this was even higher than the national average. And then another thing that was very surprising, especially because in our community, sometimes talking about mental health is a little taboo. But we did mention mental health in the survey to say, hey, are there any concerns? What's going on? And we were extremely surprised to see that over 70% of families said, yes, we do need some mental health support. We are struggling over here. And one thing that we found in the survey was that parents were saying that they were having a hard time communicating with their daughters. They're dealing with their own stress in terms of lost wages. And then maybe their daughters were talking about how they can't see their friends. And that just wasn't as important to them at that time. And so there was some friction in the homes. And so what we found through talking to our girls was that they would just go into their rooms, close the door, and would be on social media or just isolated from families. And so we knew that, we put our heads together in terms of the staff to say, how can we help during this time of isolation, of depression, of hopelessness? And so the next slide showcases some of the things that we did. So the first thing that we did was provide groceries to our families. So we actually saved money. We would provide our girls with lunch every single Saturday that they were with us. And we all know that that's the best practice, right? To provide. We had 100 girls, and so the budget that we used for this is just for our Saturday program was over 100 girls. Plus, we also have girls in our love clubs. And so overall at this time, we were serving about 165 girls in the 2020 program year. And so the first thing that we did through the money that we saved from providing meals was that we distributed groceries to families, especially those who were mentioning that they lost wages during this time. So that was the very first thing. The second thing was to kind of combat the isolation that our girls were facing. We mentioned to them, we said, you know what, you could pick anything on Amazon, as long as it was $50 or under, and it had to be something that engaged not only you, but someone in your family, like your siblings, your parents. And so you'll see the example here. Many of our girls chose this art studio easel set. They had slime making kits. There were other painting kits. There were oil kits and so forth, puzzles. We saw a lot of different activities that took place. But because there were COVID grants that were really readily available, especially here in Chicago, we used that funding to be able to provide over 50 families with the activity kits as well. Another thing that we did that's not reflected on this slide, but I do want to mention, is that we partnered with an organization that distributed $500 financial stipends to families. And so 45 families received $500 stipends during this time. Some of them did not qualify for the $600 stimulus because of tax issues and so forth. And so that $500, where we received so many testimonies around, able to pay a car note, pay some portion of the rent, pay for food. We heard a lot of great testimonies from that. And then there's two other things that's not mentioned here. We distributed 55 laptops to girls who were in need of laptops. This came through other partnerships as well as we purchased some. And what we found is that CPS, which is Chicago Public Schools, they provided at a later point, they were providing laptops to families. But what we were finding with our girls was that if there were 3 or 4 or 5 kids in a household, and CPS would only provide one laptop. So oftentimes there were multiple kids using the one computer, and that was not efficient if there were sessions that were going on, especially sometimes their siblings needed to work on homework when we had a session. And so we would supply a laptop for them for that. And then the last thing I would mention is that we also distributed care packages to our families. And we would, the initial set that went out, about 110 care packages that went out, we actually dropped those off to their homes with a note that just said we were thinking about them. And then about 20 of those 110 we mailed because maybe they lived too far or were not accessible for that particular time. So, those first 6 months really were, a time of just showing and pouring out to our families to show that we truly cared and loved them. The next piece is we created this program called Love Grows. You can see what we did for this summer, but we started this program the summer of 2020. Back when in Chicago, it was very strict about what you could do and what you could not do. And in fact, many of what our young people, grew to love and to do outside of school was not available to them. They couldn't do much but stay at home and maybe just go outside. So we were like, what could we do where we can provide a safe haven for our girls? And so we decided to create Love Grows, which is a summer experience that promoted healthy eating, active living, and good mental health. So at every session, we had a licensed clinical therapist to do some mindfulness activities with the girls, but then they got a chance to work together to planes you see in this picture is actually from 2020. And they got a chance to learn how to pot plants. They got a chance to learn how to harvest vegetables and things of that sort. And so what we saw during that summer, especially that first summer, dads came out with their daughters, grandparents came out with their daughters, moms, aunties. So it was just a family affair, if you will, during that summer where they really weren't able to do much. And so it has been great to see we're still keeping this program going, and then we'll see how we'll continue to evolve Love Grows in the future. But these last few years have been imperative as it relates to engaging families. And then the next piece I'll mention, so you heard that in the survey, parents really talked about how they wanted additional mental health supports. So we not only created the Love Grows and distributed the care packages and so forth, but we also hosted virtual mental health workshops. And the topics would be, and the two women that you see on top are our mental health experts, licensed clinical counselors that led this effort and continue to do so, quite honestly. And so topics would be such as mother-daughter communication, how to handle the stress in the pandemic. So we had a variety of topics that Chanel and Dr. Carla led throughout these last 3 years. And so another thing that we've done because of the efforts that we have had and the great statistics that have come from it, we were able to receive more funding, which provided us with opportunity. We started this last year. This provided us with the opportunity to provide group sessions and one-on-one counseling. So meaning 3 to 5 of our girls are participating now in mental health girl chats for the course of 6 to 8 weeks. And then we also provide one-on-one counseling to all of those who requested complimentary for up to 12 weeks. And so that has been a game changer for us. But we started off really just providing these virtual workshops, as you see on this slide. So the next thing I'll say is once the live mental health workshops that you just saw as an example, that was really just offered for our current parents. And one thing that we decided to do, because we were getting other parents who did not have daughters in Ladies of Virtue, we were starting to get families to say, hey, would love to have resources, or how can I support my daughter at this time? And so we decided that we would also host parent workshops as it pertains to some of the needs and concerns that parents are bringing us. And so one, for example, I just had an example of a slide that said planning for life after high school. And we always, and I should acknowledge Dr. Carla was here, as you can see, and you would think like, well, why would she be invited into planning for post-secondary, education with your daughter? Why is it important to have a licensed clinical professional counselor? Well, what we were finding during this, and maybe it was heightened because of the pandemic, but we were finding that parents were really either no, you should stay here. It's not safe right now. And it was impacting the mental health of the girls, or it would be other things in terms of pushing girls to go away to school, but maybe the girl didn't want to go away. And so it was just a lot of friction as it relates to, mind you have to think about what was going on in Chicago even before the pandemic. Our high school seniors were, the schools, the teachers went on strike. And so even the school year before the pandemic, they were primarily at home. So there was just a lot of friction as it relates to education, life after they graduate from high school, and so forth. And so what we decided to do was, for all of the parent workshops, we invited one or two of our licensed clinical professional counselors to really provide that mental health perspective. And last but not least is I'll highlight some of the other things. So I loved how there was a comment in the chat about how the nonprofit staff, we really enjoy the virtual because it creates efficiencies, and maybe the commute and all of that, it reduces commute. But what we were finding, and I saw in the comments, is said, well, participants were not necessarily feeling the virtual, right? And so I showed you an example of if there were girls that were not interested in virtual sessions, I showed you social media, which was a way that we still were able to engage them in a way that they loved. But this was another program that we created in the midst of the pandemic. It started in 2020. I highlighted this one in 2021 because this was such a good topic. It's this program, How the World Has Hurt Black Girls, is created by our girls and for our girls. And so this topic I wanted to highlight because it pertains to their parents. But as you can see in the subject here, the steps they missed. And so this was a conversation that girls wanted to have to share how their parents had caused trauma, not only during the time of the pandemic, but even growing up. And so the audience for this was their parents. So it was a very interesting conversation. But this is how we engage the girls because some of them mentioned, like, sometimes I would just notice that they are not on the session. And I'm like, hey, where have you been for the last couple of weeks? And then that's how we realized they just didn't care for the Zoom, but they still wanted to remain engaged. That's how this program came about. And so you see some of the girls who participated still were able to stay engaged in our program, still got the mentoring and all of the support, but they just engaged in a different way. So wanted to highlight that because I think it is important to meet girls where they are. So last but not least is just mentoring in the new normal. There's a lot going on. There's heightened social anxiety. There is the fear of possibly having to go back to all virtual versus in person. It's just a lot going on at this time. So some of the things that we do is one, just ask the youth and parents what they would like to do. And I will say that this seems self-explanatory or an obvious step, but what I'm also finding is that sometimes that's an extra step, right? Like as a staff member, you just like, okay, let me think of what we're gonna do. Let me create some ideas. Let me push it out. And the harder thing to do is to say, oh, now I have to plan a focus group with my young people that I serve. Now I have to plan a focus group with the parents and a listening party and really understand. I have to create a survey. I have to read all the comments, so it's harder to do all of that. It creates more steps, I should say. But it is important to understand, first and foremost, what is it that our young people like to do? And another thing I would add is what young people like to do 5 years ago is not necessarily what they like to do now. So your prior surveys or interests from 3, 4, 5 years ago, that needs to be refreshed. And we learned that because there was a field trip that our girls in years past loved to do. And now we tried to take them to that same field trip and they were like, oh, we didn't like this. And so it was very interesting to see how their needs have even evolved. Young people's needs have been evolved. One last point to that, there was some recent research that showed that several years ago, I think it was about 10 years ago, the attention span for young people was 12 seconds versus 8 seconds now. So even as you are planning different activities and icebreakers and so forth, you have to just also think about how the attention span moves so quickly. So your activities have to be engaging more so than they did in the past. The next thing you'll see here is leveraging mental health providers. As you can see, we now incorporate mental health in everything that we do. There's not one program that does not have a mental health component anymore, because we've learned through talking to our young people that there's just so much anxiety that they're facing. They're overthinking a lot of things. There's still heightened depression about what's going on in the world. Now they're like, it was the pandemic. Now I'm concerned about monkeypox. Now this, now that. And so there's just this heightened level of anxiety about a lot of different things, more so than we had when we were younger. So we incorporate mental health in everything. Identify workshops that are taught to our youth that would be also helpful for parents. We actually got this one from our parents. There were times where we provided financial literacy workshops, for example, to our young people, and then they would go home and be like, Mom, I need to download Stockpile so I can start investing. And Mom would say, well, what's Stockpile? What is investing all about? And so our parents are pushing us to say, on those critical concepts where you're teaching our daughters, we need to be exposed to that as well. So that was a very interesting point that we are, doing more of now. The next part is just exposing youth to different opportunities. So even though sometimes your programming may be virtual, there's always different opportunities that they can participate in. I know we just had our girls to participate in a national conference where they spoke at, for example. So just even thinking about, which leads me to the next one, partnering with other organizations that can provide girls with speaking opportunities. I'm noticing that they love to speak up and speak out about issues that pertain to them, issues that they're thinking about. And so anytime that you can provide them with a platform where they can do that is imperative. And then the last thing is just utilizing social media. Again, this seems more like, oh, of course, we always have a social media page, but I would say in terms of allowing young people to lead those initiatives, as well as parents as well, and taking a back seat, having staff take a back seat to what those topics and conversations look like, and letting your parents and youth take a front seat on certain things as it relates to your social media.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jamila. You guys did so much, and you were so attuned to their needs. And my first clue was that you got some toilet paper. You really knew what people were after. I saw that picture, and I was like, they were on it. But also, of course, with the much more substantive savvy that you all brought to really finding out exactly what was going on in those families and what was going on for the girls and really meeting them. So thank you for your amazing work, and thank you for sharing all of that. And so we want to have a little bit of discussion, and we've had lots of great things to share. So I know we're already past the hour, but I think we're having really good discussion here, and listeners will have a chance for you to weigh in as well. So we want to go a little more into this caregiver engagement thing. We've heard lots of things already about what families were going through and how to pull them in maybe more than before. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. Jamila, do you want to say a little bit more, since you did so much with the families? And you already shared some strategies that you recommend, but what were some of your big lessons learned about what gets caregivers, what helps them feel wanted in mentoring programs? We know that a lot of times they don't feel like there's a role for them, and programs don't necessarily really make them feel welcomed. Sometimes it's a question of scheduling and access and all those kinds of things. So what were some of your lessons learned about what really inspires parents to want to be parents and caregivers to be part of what we're doing with mentoring?
Yeah, so the biggest piece that we saw, and it kind of goes back to really talking to parents about their own interests. And so, as I mentioned before, in terms of the survey, we asked what we received back from that survey is that they were having difficulties with mother-daughter relationships. So the big lesson, one, asking parents what they want, but then two, making it fun and engaging. And so the mother-daughter conversation that we had, I mean, even to this day, it's been about a year, and we're going to bring it back this year. But our parents were like, that was life-changing, that experience, because they got a chance to their daughters speak to the licensed clinical therapist, and then the parents, and then they came back to really speak about some issues that they would not have necessarily discussed at home. And so we got that topic from them. And so I think, bringing their wishes to life and making it even more engaging than what they would have expected is a huge one. And then also I would say is incorporating some things that, that they love to do, but then also in an educational way as well. So our part 2 for the mother-daughter experience is going to be for this year. We know our girls want to learn more about doing their makeup, right? And so we're going to have a mother-daughter session that's focused on beauty, but then the second part is going to be communication. So, incorporating those fun activities with an educational element, that has been really successful for us.
Wonderful, thank you. Roger, I want to turn to you on this same topic. We have a bit of data from the study about caregivers and sort of the changing roles of caregivers, also strategies that worked. And maybe we can kind of keep it on the brief side so we can get to all our topics today, but would love to hear a little bit about what we learned in the survey about this.
Yeah, sure. So hard to follow what we just heard from Jamila, but especially with data, right? How interesting is this? But what we did find, so again, so looking at the way changes, so we asked programs to talk about how did perhaps the roles of mentors and parents vis-a-vis each other too, and how they interacted, how they interacted in support of the young people. How did that change? So what we found is, 2/3 of the program said that mentors and parents were actually collaborating more actively in support of the youth than had been the case traditionally in their programs. They thought that 2/3 said parents and youth had a closer relationship, and more than half said parents were relying on mentors for roles that they used to perform. When parents were, trying to navigate all the things that were, they were going through too during the pandemic. Half the program said that they also noticed that parents and youth had a less close relationship, and 40% said they saw parents taking on roles that they used to rely on mentors to perform. So it was kind of an interesting. We saw all variations of that. So that we asked again, I sort of previewed this earlier. So we asked programs what strategies that you used with trying to engage families were particularly effective. So 90% said doing one-on-one outreach by the phone was particularly effective in trying to engage families. But a number of them thought that one-on-one outreach by text message could work. One-on-one outreach by video chat was also effective, and one-on-one outreach by email. Doing a virtual orientation of the program was one that about 2/3 of the program said was particularly effective, and a newsletter. Over half said doing a newsletter for the families was another way to engage families. On the flip of that, though, there were a number of strategies that programs said these are particularly not effective in engaging families, and that involved doing in-person things, even following the social distancing protocols. And small group outreach also was a strategy that programs said, yeah, that really doesn't work. Virtual activities for families that were on the wait list wasn't one that they found particularly effective. And doing home visits too, interestingly, was not found to be particularly effective in engaging families. Yeah, let's go on. And these are, so when we ask programs, to talk about some examples of what were, examples of meaningful caregiver engagement, these are just some quotes that came up from them. So we talk to every parent or guardian on a regular schedule and get their inputs, which is, we heard from Jamila that was something that they use, right? That's one of her lessons learned, or what. We have respected parents' wishes regarding contact and distance and have been attentive to changing needs and duties within households. They also shared resources for food, rent assistance, eviction prevention, and access to technology and other resources. Running virtual interviews and orientations with all of our incoming students and families, and provided those and all materials in both English and Spanish. Another quote, we provided information about our agency's ability to provide rental, food, Jewish holiday, sorry, the chat message was blocking the quote, and emotional support during the pandemic if needed. So that's really important, because how else would parents, families even think to ask the mentoring program, right? And so making sure that was being promoted so that folks would know, hey, we could ask for help here. And then the last one here, our hope is to create regular monthly caregiver newsletter with program announcements and resources that will continue after the pandemic. Again, thinking about things that worked during the pandemic, that's going to be part of how we do business as usual from here on out.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. And again, I just want to say that I think this aspect is so important, because we know that it was an area of need before the pandemic to better engage parents and families. And it kind of seems like COVID may have sort of prompted some new kinds of interactions with parents. Maybe they had to, and caregivers, maybe they had to work with them more just to make the mentoring work, and with all the changing needs and changing roles. So I think we're learning a lot, both about how caregiver engagement is changing, but also just about how to do it in the first place, because we had limited data on that before, and a lot of programs weren't giving it as much attention, which was a big issue for match quality. It's also a big issue for equity, because when you think about the idea that most formal mentoring programs are run primarily by middle-class white women, and a lot of mentors are middle-class white women, not all, of course, and the majority of mentees and their families are working class and or of color, it's pretty problematic for mentoring programs to be saying, oh, the parents aren't so important, or I don't need to engage them. So I'm glad to see some of that changing. So let's move on. Great responses, guys. I'm going to be really quick about this. One of the things that we thought was important about all these findings, because we don't know what the future is going to hold, right? We don't know how many of these strategies that were helpful during COVID are going to be helpful in the new normal. We don't know what's going to be helpful if there are other crises. But what we do know is that figuring out how to find out from your participants what they need when you're in a crisis situation and things are changing quickly, how to get that input from your caregivers, from your mentors, and from your youth, that seems to be the critical thing, one of the critical things we can take away to say, as things change, how will I make sure I do a good job? We had a little data on this from the survey. We asked about how folks elicited participant voice during the process of adapting to COVID. And I color-coded them because you can see there's some parallels here. But a lot of it was done just through the regular interactions. So just regular match support, regular check-ins, but asking many more questions about what people wanted, what would work for them, what their needs are, et cetera. Also through more formal means of getting feedback like surveys and questionnaires and things like that. And then leadership opportunities for all three groups were also used. And providing family services more than before, like we said. So these are some of the things that folks did. Do either presenter and folks in the listeners, if you guys could type in your thoughts about how did you find out what your folks needed in your program? Put some of your ideas in the chat. That would be really helpful. Does either panelist want to say anything about what you think about this question of voice? And Jamila already said quite a bit about how she made sure to engage their voices. Roger, was there any other insights you had from the study?
I don't have any other insights on the study. I agree. I thought Jamila gave us some really cool examples of having done this. And I will just say from my previous experience in running a mentoring program that youth leadership, that it's really undervalued. I think that I loved your example, Jamila, where the girls were talking about, like, here's what we missed, right? Like every time, because they never come back from those experiences seeing themselves the way they used to, right? Like it changes the way what their potential, right? How they see. So yeah, I love that that's being elevated here too.
You're on mute.
Yeah, I was just looking at the, no, I didn't have any additional comments. I was just looking at the post here from Emily that said focus groups and small oral group chats are powerful. Absolutely. I leverage, formal focus groups and informal. Sometimes I just will pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm struggling with this, or I'm thinking about this idea. What do you think? Or how should we enhance it? Or what should we do? And so, even if you can't get 10 girls at one time because you need an answer right away, sometimes just picking up the phone and quickly, talking to some of the participants have been extremely valuable. So I just wanted to highlight what Emily said.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I'm sorry, I was having some audio issues there, but great points. And I thought that was a great example, Jamila, of how for mentoring programs, we have this advantage of having a lot of individual contact with our folks. So it's great to do surveys and things like that, but you can do it in real time when you're doing a check-in. You can get feedback and input, and that's what a lot of the respondents in our survey said as well. So the last topic I wanted to get to, and this is where we can actually start to hear more from our listeners as well, is when we talk about all these changes, these things don't come without a cost, right? These things don't, the ratcheting up support for matches, changing systems to meet the needs in changing times. All of these things take resources and they take staff time. And so one of the things that we learned from the survey is that there were very highly increased demands on staff, and that was a barrier for them in being able to effectively support matches. And that it created a lot of stress, a lot of burnout, a lot of availability, partly due to the workload itself and the difficulties that the families were facing, but also because staff themselves were dealing with the pandemic and stressed out and having problems at home as well. Some of that we hope is easing, but it does speak to this idea that if we're going to ratchet up support and keep some of these enhanced practices, that may have staffing and capacity implications. So I wanted to hear from folks listening, if you can put in the chat, what are things that you're observing about your work today as far as capacity issues? So staffing, working conditions, stressors that people are dealing with, program and systems barriers, but also emerging opportunities and any good innovations and learning. So it's a great chance if you guys can enter into the chat some of the things that you're observing out there. I think that's really helpful. So I'll give you a quick second to think about that. And as you do, panelists, if you have any thoughts you'd like to add about what are you seeing in terms of, and just what are your thoughts about, so this idea that mentoring, we've always thought of it as a fairly low-cost intervention, and we've always tried to be careful about saying that's not free, though, and we do have to support programs. And of course, it's still much less expensive than some of the more invasive interventions we're hoping to prevent or divert from with mentoring. But do we need to rethink this idea of mentoring as kind of a low-cost intervention, given what programs are dealing with these days? Roger, I know you had some key thoughts about that, so I'll let you start, but I bet Jamila has some good ideas too.
Yeah, I mean, just one of the things that we saw in the responses was how much staff were taking on, right? So we asked, how are you addressing needs? And, they said, oh, some of it was they were asking mentors to do. Some of it they were using partners too. So I really saw that come through in what Jamila was talking about. But for most, the biggest answer was staff are taking that on. And I just think that, and in order to keep doing some of this, right, like I feel like we've gotten to a place where the only way to do these things well is we're going to have the staff capacity. And that is not going to come. That's not going to be a budget neutral,
Right.
factor, right? So yeah.
Right. Jamila, anything brief to add before we have time for one or two questions from the audience?
Yeah, it's so funny that you mentioned mentoring as a low cost, intervention, because I'm glad that storyline is shifting, because I just had an interesting conversation with a school administrator who had asked, why was our cost so high? Because I guess they were familiar with other mentoring programs that was less than half of the cost. And I stood my ground. I'm like, hey, we're providing mental health workshops with a licensed clinical counselor several times throughout the time that you're contracted with us. We provide field trips. We have a full-time program facilitator with benefits. So I went into probably more detail than what I really probably needed to, but I wanted her to understand I'm not just charging to go, for this mentoring program as a get rich scheme, right? Like, we are providing much needed services for the youth that we serve. And in order to do that, we have to charge accordingly. And so, it ended up being approved, but it was a very interesting back and forth conversation for about a week before that was approved. And so I think we just need to stand our ground. We need to be confident in the work that we're doing. We have to obviously show how we're spending the money, of course, but at the end of the day, we have, in order to provide the services that our youth deserve, we have, it's not a low cost intervention, and that has to be a thing of the past. And so just wanted to add that I definitely stood my ground. I talked about some of the things that we're doing within Ladies of Virtue and how that's different amongst other programming that may be out there, but I stood my ground and it was accepted. So just wanted to share that as well.
Yeah, so helpful. I'm so glad you were able to do that, and yeah, very much agree. And I think you know, you were doing mentoring, but you were providing all these other services for the families, and that's something that we know about the mentoring field too. There are standalone mentoring programs that are doing only that, but a lot of mentoring programs have mentoring as part of an array of services and are doing pretty comprehensive work. And then we know how important the mentoring is all by itself. So I think that's really critical. And I'm seeing some great answers in the chat as well about what people are seeing with difficulty filling staff positions and other things. So this is great information. Thanks, folks, for sharing. And I think we have time for, I see a question in here. I think we have time. We've answered some questions along the way as well. One is, are there any thoughts, or if you can point to some good research on youth-to-youth cross-age mentoring with matches for gender fluid or non-binary mentees? Interested in hearing how folks are approaching matching with non-binary with youth. I don't know if anybody here has specific things to say about that. Certainly, there's good research on peer mentoring. I'd be happy to do some looking around if there's any specifically for non-binary and non-gender conforming youth. Does anybody else here have anything specific on that?
Off the top of my head, I don't either. But yeah, I appreciate the importance of the question.
Absolutely, yeah. And to the person who asked the question, Gabe, if you want to reach out to me after, I'd be happy to look up some stuff for you. Any last closing comments? And then I know Bianca's going to take us through a little bit of housekeeping. And we do have some additional resources that Jamila has provided. Whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to click on that. Let's go back. Hold on. And here's how to get in touch with us in the future. We do have a national community of practice on caregiver engagement if you're particularly interested in that topic. And we will make the recording and slides available after the session. Oops, I didn't mean to unshare. So, so Bianca, do you want to take us through our last couple things here? Thanks everyone for being here. It's been a really great session. And thank you so much to Jamila and Roger for your wonderful insights, and to the mentor team for supporting us.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was really, really great. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Destian. Thank you, Jamila. Just a couple last things. Destian, if you could go to the next slide. We will be following up with a survey. Please take time to fill out the survey and let us know how we're doing. And of course, we want to make sure that we are incorporating your feedback in the future. Next slide. If you have any questions or anything, you can always email us and show us some love on social media. Tweet with the hashtag mentoring webinar. Visit our webpage for all of the past and upcoming webinars. And our next webinar, well, we have two in August. If you can go to the next slide. So next week on August 4th, the National Mentoring Center will be doing a webinar on risk management. So if you want to learn a little bit about how to just tighten up on those risk management practices, which we know are so important, please join. And then August 25th is the next collaborative mentoring webinar, which will be expanding mentorships to center Gen Z in regards to their agency, advocacy, and decision-making. So that's August 25th. And so that is it. Thank you so much for joining. And everyone, please have a great rest of your Thursday.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Take care.